Welcome everyone. We are very excited for you to join us today. This webinar is a primer on deliberate practice supervision with myself and my friend and colleague, Alexandre Vaz. Alex and I are with Sentio. We do a number of things, including run the Sentio Counseling Center, where we train supervisors. We have a year-long supervisor training that is very intensive, involves 50 hours of video-based training. If you're interested in that, please go to the link that Alex is putting on the chat or the website in the slide. At Sentio, all therapy sessions are videotaped. All of our counselors use routine outcome monitoring every session. All of our counselors have weekly individual supervision, group supervision, and deliberate practice skills training, and all supervision sessions are videotaped. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. We're able to do all this while providing therapy for $30 a session for clients. This used to be very expensive and cumbersome and challenging, and modern technology has actually made this pretty accessible. So today we are going to be reviewing the Sentio supervision model. We are releasing this model in what's called an open source format, which means everyone is welcome to use it in your own supervision. You can use it in your own teaching. You can use it in your own training. You can use it however you want. And you're also welcome to kind of use it in your publications, that kind of thing. It's on our website. Everything we talk about today is for free on our website. The model is made up of 7 steps, and rather than just walking through them now, Alex, let's go through them later on because people aren't going to remember them all now. But we're going to go through all 7 steps today.
Great. So you want to go ahead and start talking about the first one?
Yes. So the first step is checking client outcomes and the deliberate practice homework. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So this is an example of how we check outcomes. Our outcome system is called the OQ45. That's called Outcome Questionnaire. And we're going to move through this fairly quickly today. If you want a more advanced training in this, contact us. But what we can do is pretty quickly and easily, our supervisors can scan an entire caseload of a counselor. So what you're seeing here is...
Sorry, Tony.
is all the cases for a counselor. We've blocked out the names to protect privacy. And you can see that some of the clients are green or white, which means they're doing well. And one is yellow and one is red, which means they're at risk. And those are the cases we want to focus on in supervision. Next slide, please. This is an example of a zoom in to the outcome data of a client who is doing well. So when the blue line is moving down, that means their symptoms are going down. And you see here over 11 sessions of therapy, their symptoms are gradually going down, which means improving. Next slide. This is an example of a client who is unfortunately doing worse, or we would call deteriorating. So even though their symptoms went down at first just a little, they then went gradually up to 10 sessions. This is an example of a client we would really want to focus on in supervision. Next slide. Great. So next, we are going to talk about the supervision preparation form. This is a form we have all of our trainees complete before they start supervision. They bring this to supervision. Now, something I want to emphasize is that we do not ask our supervisors to do any prep for supervision before the supervision session. So they do not have to review notes. They definitely do not have to review client videos before session. Rather, the supervisee completes this form and fills out information about a client they want to focus on. And then the supervisor also looks at the outcome dashboard that we just reviewed to see if there might be something the supervisee is missing. Our goal is to do all the steps you see here in 50 minutes, 50-minute supervision session without any prep before or time spent afterwards.
Some might call it an ambitious goal.
So this is the supervision preparation form, and this is available on our website, and this is what the supervisee fills out 24 hours prior to every supervision session. We have them show up in supervision with this form, and we have them read it out loud to the supervisor. All right, we do not have them send it to the supervisor before supervision. We have them read it out loud at the beginning of supervision, and the reason is we want the supervisee and the supervisor on the same page, focus on the same material. Now, sometimes the supervisee, the trainee, might pick a client to focus on that is not the right client to pick, or the trainee might pick some aspect of the case that the supervisor disagrees with. And that's fine. The supervisor definitely has the right to overrule the supervisee and say, well, I know you want to talk about client A, but client B is deteriorating, or client B is suicidal, so instead we're going to talk about client B. So the supervisor is in control of the session, but we're making every effort possible for the supervisor and the supervisee to collaboratively come to agreement on what to focus on in supervision. The degree of collaboration in supervision is very important. In deliberate practice supervision, it is especially important, because deliberate practice supervision is considerably harder than traditional supervision. Next
Hence,
slide.
I should add, in our supervision residency, it's normal that it should take 6 months to a year to actually be able to do this consistently.
Yeah, that's what we found. In our year-long supervision training, it takes roughly 6 months to a year for supervisors to really get the hang of this. But you're going to get it in this hour.
The crash course. Okay, now to the good stuff. So you check the client outcomes of your trainee. The trainee brought in a supervision preparation form, and they suggested a client to focus on. Now we're focusing on identifying a client challenge and identifying a therapist deficit. It's a little bit of a lingo we have in the little practice. I'll let you know what it is exactly. But always remember, in the little practice, we're trying to make things very concrete, right? We're trying to work at the level where whatever it is that you're describing, you could actually watch in a therapy video or therapy recording. So, what is a client challenge? A client challenge is something that the client is saying or doing that is a struggle for the trainee, right? So let me give you an example. Let's imagine that the supervisee and the trainee are looking at a client video, and they notice in the video that the client is criticizing lack of progress in therapy. Let's imagine the client is saying, I don't know why I bother coming to therapy. This isn't helping, right? So that would be a client challenge. It's something observable that the client is saying that probably should be addressed. And the therapist deficit is our jargon for what the therapist does that is not helping. Very important. So therapist deficit is what the therapist is doing, the trainee really is doing in the session that is actually not addressing the client challenge effectively. Again, let's imagine you're watching a therapy recording of your trainee. You see the client challenge, client is criticizing lack of progress in therapy, and you see that the trainee in the video starts to defensively attempt to convince the client of progress. And you fairly quickly realize through watching the video, this isn't really working. It's not really addressing the client challenge, right? So we call that a therapist deficit because it's a growth area for the trainee, right? It's something that we want to focus on and help the trainee be able to do something different, do something better, right? And again, notice in our definition of client challenge and therapist deficit, these are all observable things. If you had a recording, you could see it. These are not conceptual, high order theoretical things. So through painstaking experimentation and a lot of failure on my part and Tony's, and the patience of the supervisors that work with us, we have been able to devise micro steps for each of our supervision model steps. So we have in the supervision model the step of identifying a client challenge, and we divide that into two trainable micro steps for the supervisor. The first step is that the supervisor should just highlight an observable client behavior that's important, that's relevant. And this is zero interpretation, zero theory. Supervisor just mentions, oh, notice that your client is saying or doing X, right? If you don't have a client video or a therapy video, it's fine. You could also just get your talk your way into this to try to understand what is the exact client behavior to focus on. So first, we're just focusing on a client behavior, and then the supervisor tries to formulate this client behavior theoretically. As briefly as possible, we don't go into a 50-minute case formulation, but we try to understand, make sense of what is happening here. What is this client challenge? What does it mean? Right? So the supervisor might take the lead in saying, I think what's happening here with this client is X, right? For example, this client seems to be frustrated. There seems to be an alliance rupture here going on. This client, for example, might be a bit emotionally dysregulated, whatever it is, right? And by the way, we have a very frequent question we get about the little practice is there space for theoretical formulation? Is there space for a case formulation? And the answer is a resounding yes. It's just a little bit different the way we do it. So in deliberate practice supervision, we try to keep our formulations as tight as possible so that we can then move to actual skills rehearsal. So in this case, the formulation is just trying to formulate or understand what you're seeing the client doing, right? And so we formulate that, and hopefully you get a shared agreement with the trainee about what's going on for the client. That's already a huge plus for the trainee because a lot of trainees, as I'm sure you're aware, and licensed professionals, let's be honest, will come to supervision and say, I have no idea what's going on for my client. I do not understand what's going on here, right? So they need some help from the supervisor to make sense of it. So that's step one of identifying the client challenge, making sense of it. Then we move on to identifying a therapist deficit. So the supervisor identifying a therapist deficit. And reminder, so therapist deficit is what the therapist or the trainee is doing that is not addressing the client challenge, right? And again, we've divided this stage into 4 micro steps that you as a supervisor can do. The first one is as a supervisor, again, just pointing out. So I noticed that when the client is doing X, this challenge, I also noticed that you, the trainee, are responding with Y, right? For example, I noticed that when the client starts crying, you, the therapist, starts changing the subject. For example, just pointing out a therapist behavior. We can then ask as a supervisor, what was your intention behind this intervention? So you did this thing. What were you trying to do when you did this thing with your client? Now, it's a very interesting question at this stage because frankly, some trainees and courageous professionals might just say, I have no idea. I had no intention. I was just winging it. I really don't know what to do with this client challenge. And that is totally fine. But sometimes the trainee might say, oh, I was trying to do whatever, and the supervisor might or might not agree. But this helps kind of unpack a little bit your perception. Is the trainee trying to get somewhere? Do they actually have a map to try to address this client challenge? And then we check with the facts. So you tried this thing, you had an intention, probably. How did the client react to your intervention? Right? Again, sticking with observable client behaviors. So again, let's go back to the example I said before. Let's imagine you're watching a therapy video with your supervisee. The client is crying. That's the challenge. The therapist starts changing the subject. That's the deficit. And you see how the client react to the intervention. Maybe they get upset. Maybe they, stop crying, but they start to withdraw from the therapy relationship. So not a great outcome, right? So finally, we cap it off with this last step here in identifying the therapist deficit, which is the supervisor being explicit that the intervention the trainee is doing might be keeping them stuck. Right? And you could literally read from our supervision model, kind of follow along in each of these quotes and say, trainee, this intervention that you're doing here might be keeping you stuck because X, Y, and Z. Now, at this point, I should say, it's very tempting to just skip altogether this step of identifying the therapist deficit. In our experience, it's very easy as a supervisor to just focus on the client. What is the client saying and doing? And then jumping immediately to what skills could we practice to address it. We have found that it is pretty good to slow down and really take your time to identify the therapist deficit and help your trainee understand what they're doing that's keeping them stuck, because that increases the chances that next time they will not repeat the same mistake. It's kind of like, you can see I have a bunch of guitars and a piano behind me. It's not enough for my guitar teacher to tell me what to do. I also need my guitar teacher to tell me what not to do, right? When I was in music conservatory, my music teacher would be constantly pointing out things that I was doing that were keeping me stuck, right? If you keep your hand in that posture, you will not be able to play this chord. Let's imagine, right? Same thing applies here. It is very helpful for us as trainees and professionals to get concrete feedback on the things that are keeping us stuck, right? So these are the 2 steps of identifying the client challenge, identifying the therapist deficit. Let's show you an example, a video example of what we're talking about. So this is an example from a supervision session at our counseling center, the Sentio Counseling Center. And so in this video, I'll just read through this. In this video, a trainee in supervision is showing a therapy video of her doing a self-regulation exercise with an emotionally dysregulated client. In this video, the supervisor helps break down the client challenge, as seen in the video, and how the therapist could be more effective. Right? So let's watch.
So as you're watching this, Mia, just notice kind of what her eyes are doing.
And just kind of taking some deep breaths and letting that vision soak in.
Like she's blinking like, whoa, she's a little bit overwhelmed. And she also really likes the intervention. So I think when we're talking about what might we shift here, like what's the opportunity for you? So going over to like the client challenge is she's not well regulated. And
Okay, I'm going to pause here to point out a couple of things. Notice that the supervisor is switching between a recording of the client therapy recording, right? And the supervisor is pointing out observable client behaviors, right? So this is this step we mentioned of directly mentioning. You notice that the client is blinking a lot as you're talking, for example, right? Notice also that the supervisor is actually sharing her screen and sharing the Sentio supervision model. We have found that this is a super collaborative way so that the supervisee, the trainee, knows what the supervisor is doing. Each step of the way, the supervisor is being explicit about what step they're in the supervision process, right? So they go through step 2, and now they're in step 3, identifying the client challenge, and the supervisor is just going through each step together, right? All right, let's keep watching.
the client challenge is she's not well regulated. And so what I think might be happening in this moment is she's getting overwhelmed while you're talking with her about some of the regulation options she has. And so when your client's feeling overwhelmed, I think the thing that was happening here is you're overloading her with information.
Oh, the blink.
You're giving her a little too much. So, all right. We know your intention, right? Your intention was
to help her self-regulate.
boom. And like that intention, I actually think was great. I feel very good about that intention. I think your client reacted. How did you see your client react to the intervention?
Well, she expresses, she says she likes it. And then after the video, if the video plays on, she starts to cry and she says, I wish I had these tools, previously.
I love it. And so the only thing here I think is that's keeping you stuck is rushing to give her
Mhm.
more information about what you're doing. You can let her sit in the feel your butt against the chair. And because what you end up saying is like, well, like for some people, like what helps them is imagining this thing, right? Like you're doing it in this psychoeducational framing, which not a problem, but you had gotten her to drop in already. She was already dropped into her body. She was like wiggling in her chair. Her breathing had started to slow. And in that moment, when you were helping her self-regulate, you inadvertently pulled her out of it. You put her right back in. So it's not a long-term issue, but you had pulled her out of it. Do you see what I'm talking about when we watch the tape with that in mind?
I see what you mean, Mackenzie. Yes, yes.
Cool. And so what I'm wondering in terms of things that we can practice is letting yourself slow down once she starts to drop in.
And we'll see a couple more video examples. But again, I want to highlight, notice that the supervisor is showing the supervision model throughout the supervision process. They go back to the therapy recording so that they're focused on reality, not projecting and self-reporting about what they think the client, what happened in the session. And Mackenzie, the supervisor, is doing a great job just pointing out, okay, I'm seeing this in the client. This is how I would formulate it. I'm seeing you, the trainee, are doing this. And what might be keeping you stuck by you doing this is X, Y, and Z, right? So a very kind of concrete process, step by step. All right. So let's imagine you as a courageous supervisor have checked the client outcomes. Your trainee has brought a preparation form. You've identified a client challenge to focus on, something concrete the client is doing that you want to focus on. You've identified a therapist deficit, meaning what the therapist is doing that is keeping them stuck. Now we're getting to the really good stuff. Now, as a supervisor, we need to collaborate with the trainee to identify a learning goal. This is step 5 in our supervision model. So what is a learning goal? Basically, it's a fancy word for a clinical skill. So let's take the same example I said last time. Let's imagine you're looking at the video with your supervisee. You're seeing the client challenge is the client is criticizing lack of progress in therapy. You've identified a deficit in the trainee, that the trainee was defensively attempting to convince the client of progress. For example, a learning goal that the supervisor might propose would be, instead of defensively attempting to convince the client of progress, to first acknowledge the client's comment and inquire about their feelings, right? So the supervisor might just suggest this. How about instead of doing that, we can practice doing this other thing that hopefully will address this client challenge more effectively. Now, at this point, we have to make a very important note, is that there is no one perfect learning goal for any client challenge that your trainee brings in. Right? It's not like there's only one skill for every client challenge that you identify, right? So as a supervisor, identifying a learning goal to practice is a best guess. It's informed by your therapy model, by clinical experience and research, and it's also the reason why our supervision model is trans-theoretical, right? Meaning anyone from any theoretical background, it can be CBT, psychodynamic, EFT, whatever it is, anyone from any theoretical background can use this supervision model, because we are agnostic when it comes to which skills to practice, right? We tend to say that deliberate practice focuses on how to practice, not what to practice, right? So as deliberate practice enthusiasts, myself, Tony, and the Sentio crew, we are happy to train everyone in how to do deliberate practice and deliberate practice supervision. We really are hands off about what skills trainees are going to practice.
Alex, can I jump in
Tony.
for a second? Yeah, so I want to emphasize this. We've got about 20 supervisors that we've trained at Sentio, and they all work in somewhat different models. We've got psychodynamic, CBT, we've got systemic, we've got EFT, we've got MI, I mean, we've got narrative, and we encourage our supervisors to work from different models, or to find a model that works for the client and the trainee and the supervisor. You kind of need a mix of all of them. And so everything we're teaching today is transmodal. and it should work across models. Thank you, Alex.
You. All right. So there is no one perfect learning goal. Which, okay, I can't help but say, which actually is a weight off everyone's shoulder because the bar is, I wouldn't say the bar is low for you as a supervisor, but it's not hyper high. What we like to say is that what you as a supervisor have to do is suggest something that's at least better than what the trainee is already doing, right? So if the bar is the trainee is defensively attempting to convince the client of progress, your task as a supervisor really is to propose a learning goal or a skill that's at least better, hopefully more effective than that, right? Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's a bit harder. Usually you get there. All right, so this leads to the next step in our supervision model, which is identifying the learning goal in micro steps. So we're still in identify the learning goal, but we divided it into 3 micro steps. As a supervisor, and again, you can have the supervision model and just read off the model, right? So what we tend to suggest is, as a supervisor, you first may propose a skill to practice. So you can say, how about trainee that we practice the skill of, empathic understanding, for example, right? Then the supervisor provides a rationale for why the skill might be helpful. So supervisor says, I think this skill might be helpful because it's going to address the client's frustration. It's going to bring out blah, 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 right? Finally, the supervisor proposes modeling the intervention. So would you like me to show an example of this skill? The reason we have this micro step here, the third step here, is that a lot of trainees might theoretically understand what you're proposing. So for example, let's imagine that you suggested a trainee, it would be great if you did, let's see, oh my God, so many skills. Cognitive restructuring.
Let me give an example. For
Great,
example,
Tony, thank you. Good save.
So something that we'll get a lot from trainees is, well, why don't we jump in and do some chair work? Right, chair work is used across many models, especially like EFT and schema therapy and a bunch of other models. However, chair work is fairly emotionally evocative for clients. And it also requires clients to understand what's going on, and it's just not appropriate for everyone. And it has to be set up well, and it's the kind of skill that if it doesn't go well, it can go pretty poorly. Clients can have a bad reaction. And so it's not uncommon for a trainee to request chair work or another skill which is just not appropriate for a client. And so in that case, we want our supervisors to jump in and be like, well, that's a great skill, but maybe not for this client at this time. Instead, we're going to do this other skill. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah. So a lot of trainees need an example of the skill itself before actually being able to do it. This is how we learn. We know this from basic learning research is monkey see, monkey do, right? We see someone else doing it and we try it ourselves. And often that's how we learn skills. So let's see another video example. This is a different supervisee and a different therapist. And in this video, a trainee brought to supervision a different clinical challenge. So they brought to supervision a client challenge of a client who has already met his goals for treatment, and therapy is now starting to feel aimless. Okay, pretty interesting challenge. So let's see what the supervisor does with this using the supervision model.
He's just less distressed and he's met his goals.
Right.
Okay. And that is challenging, Terry. I am challenged by this all the time. I validate you because it's sort of like, what are we doing here? Are we using this time, or are we sort of aimless? Are we just kind of talking with no goal? I'm only seeing a very small clip, but it sounds like both of us are wondering if sometimes, Terry, clients start to feel better, but they feel anxious about letting therapy go. They might not be aware of how much better they're doing. They also might have some mixed feelings, Terry, about am I good on my own? Or is there more stuff I want to work on? So that's kind of like my formulation of what might be happening here. Does that kind of match your sense?
Yeah.
When a client says, I want to go bi-weekly, I think I'm doing pretty well. Sometimes, Terry, that is them trying on being done with therapy. It's like they're sort of easing.
Right.
And I'm not saying that we're going to practice pushing him there, but what I'm noticing is, you know, he chit chats about seeing his parents, and you respond kind of by chit chatting back about
Yeah.
how hard it is to deal with aging parents. What was your goal in doing that?
Basically just meeting the client. After I said it, I really went, oh my gosh, I wish that wouldn't have rolled out of my mouth.
You mean the disclosure about your mom?
Yeah.
What,
Yeah.
and what concerned you about that?
I just wish I would have had a stronger boundary
Hmm.
because I have seen this client for a while because he is so casual. And I felt that maybe that that should have been a boundary.
Like you leaned more into kind of Terry the person chit-chatting versus Terry the therapist. Yeah.
Yep.
I mean,
Yep.
that's good awareness on your part. And I think maybe you leaned into Terry the person chit-chatting because he's not feeling like a client to you.
Right.
He's feeling like somebody who's kind of updating you in a
Right.
relaxed way.
And it's again, it's content versus working in therapy.
So
I feel like I'm collecting content.
right. You're collecting updates, content from his week rather than working.
Mhm.
to people. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's important. So he goes back to kind of, you know, making some valid complaints about his parents, but it doesn't seem like it's really upsetting him, and you're still not really sure
Right.
what it is that you guys are working on. So I think
Mhm.
it might be more like, again, you're kind of chit-chatting, following his lead in the topics. But I think what would be more effective and what we could practice first is in those first, like kind of the early few minutes of a session,
Mhm.
practicing checking in.
Okay.
Saying, and I think in this case, what we could first practice, Terry, is just checking in about how biweekly has been feeling. Have you done that with him yet?
No, I haven't. I have not specifically done that.
So this is a skill where we are directly talking to the client about therapy, and we're directly exploring, getting their feedback, their experience of how it's been feeling to them to meet twice a month. This is a good starting point, Terry, to start to explore more about how he's feeling about therapy in general, and maybe
Sure.
giving him some feedback about how. You want me to model an example?
Yes, please.
Okay, you got it.
Alex, can I just highlight a few things
Yeah.
quickly? So I just want to highlight a few things in that video. First of all, you'll notice that the supervisor had the Sentio supervision model form open for most of the video. And she was walking down it and highlighting the section where they were at. We encourage supervisors to do this. We aim for as much transparency as possible in supervision. Ideally, the supervisee knows where they are in the model and why they're there. We found that this really helps foster trust and collaboration in supervision. That's one. Two, you notice how the supervisor was spending a fair amount of time helping the supervisee see and understand their skill deficit before moving on to skill rehearsal. And this can be really helpful for addressing a case conceptualization, kind of what's happening in the bigger picture, and why they're going to rehearse a certain skill. Thanks, Alex.
And to add to what Tony just said, I mean, it's a pretty vulnerable position to be in also as a trainee, that they're coming in with their mistakes and wanting feedback on very observable mistakes. So the transparency and the trust really is needed to do this kind of work. Also, notice something, the supervisor suggested a skill of checking in with the client, right? And we often get the question, isn't that too easy a skill? Like, isn't that a basic skill? Now, this leads to a fascinating thing that we discovered, is that something that's easy conceptually, intellectually, is often not easy at all procedurally. What Tony is writing on the chat, no skill is too easy. At first, we get this feedback a lot. Oh, it's too easy. My trainees don't need to practice empathic interventions. They don't need to practice validation. The reasoning behind that is that most trainees can give you a good theoretical description of the skill. They might even be able to write a great paper on the skill. But if you actually tell them to do the skill with a real client, it's not going to come out as eloquent. I love, by the way, that what I'm saying Tony is writing. It's like it's almost as if we work together.
I noticed in my own training, I got really good at writing papers about skills. For example, MI skills. I could get A's on all my MI papers, but you sit me down with someone who is ambivalent, at an early stage of change, and then you'd see how easy the skill actually was for me. So we have a saying that the supervisor is not doing the training, rehearsal is doing the training, and the rehearsal will reveal how easy a skill actually is.
And this mirrors research on expertise from other fields. If you look at expertise in, let's imagine, basketball, there is no point in the basketball player's career where they stop practicing dribbling the basketball, right? It's not like the basketball player goes, oh, I've done that, it's too easy, now I move on. No, throughout the whole career as a musician, I practice the scales. There's never a point where I stop doing that. We're proposing that, again, in psychotherapy, kind of the same thing. There is no skill too easy to practice. Now, if you then practice and the trainee does do a great job and it's too easy for the trainee, we move on, sure. But often that is not what you'll find out. Okay, so let's move on. All right. So we've done a lot of preparation here to get to skills rehearsal. So we've checked client outcomes. The trainee brought a preparation form. We've identified a concrete client challenge. We've identified a concrete therapist deficit. We've identified a learning goal, a skill to practice. And now step 6 is behavior rehearsal. Interestingly, most people, when they think about the word practice, they just think about behavior rehearsal. But really, the gold standard is having all of these steps, right? Everything you've done up until this point is building towards skill rehearsal, right?
Alex, can I just say, just to set realistic expectations, like we said earlier, we typically find it takes 6 to 12 months for supervisors to fit all this into a 50-minute supervision session. And it's a little messy at first. And so if you're going to try doing this yourself as a supervisor, just, be patient, have some self-compassion, and kind of work your way through the model over time. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah. All right. So we're on skills rehearsal, behavior rehearsal. What's the supervisor's task here? So during behavior rehearsal, 3 basic tasks the supervisor has to do. The supervisor should be helping the trainee engage in practicing the skill they've identified and providing brief behavioral feedback that encourages return to rehearsal. Notice the underlying. This is maybe the hardest part of the supervision model, is restraint in part of the supervisor. As trainers and supervisors, we can talk for hours, right? We love doing that, and trainees often nod along and they love doing that, right? So this is different. We are trying to provide very brief, very concrete feedback that encourages the trainee to try again, right? And we're trying to strike a balance between positive and corrective feedback. Meaning, as supervisors, we're being very concrete. Here's what you're doing as you're rehearsing. Here's what I'm seeing that's good. And here's what I'm seeing that could be better. So, and now the third thing, the magic words, let's try it again. if you take one thing from this webinar, is practicing this sentence. The sentence, let's try that again, is magic words in your practice supervision. Because what we want really is repetition. Again, what Tony was saying, it's the rehearsal that's doing the training. So the more rehearsal that happens, the more training happens, right? This is hard. So again, let's see a video example from a different supervisor from the Sentio Counseling Center with a different trainee. And in this case, this is a trainee seeing a couple. So the trainee is doing couples therapy with a high conflict couple. And she asks her supervisor for help on how to use emotionally focused couples therapy with this couple. So in this video, they went through all these steps that we've identified and up until now in the supervision model. And so the supervisor suggested to rehearse the skill of pause, validate, reflect, ask. So it's quite of a complex skill, kind of a 4-step skill, right? So let's watch. Oh, and before we watch, I should mention. So one of the magic here is the trainee is rehearsing using the therapy video, right? The trainee is looking at the therapy video and she's rehearsing as if she's back with the client right now to make it experiential, right? Let's watch.
Okay, pause, validate, reflect, and then ask.
Yes.
Okay, let's pause right here. I understand that your thoughts are that she has the facts of the whole scenario wrong. I hear you on that.
Yeah, that's okay. You're doing well. Validate the pain. Validate that this is hard for him, right?
Okay. Let me try putting it in my head again. Okay,
Sure.
let's pause here for a minute. I hear that he doesn't like, should I say like your view, because he doesn't like the emotion word. So your view is that she doesn't have the facts right.
Good. Yeah, that's fine. It's good.
And then I understand that. And when I'm done with, I'm going to shift the focus to you. Is that okay?
Good. Yeah. The only piece you didn't say, but I don't think it needs to be said, is I need to spend more time with here, right? Like I have a reason for this basically. Like I need to spend a little bit more time with her, and then I promise I'll come back to you.
Okay.
But I think it's fine the way you did it. So you're stopping him, you're validating the pain that's leading him to intervene like he is, and then you're asking for permission to just stay with her a little bit. It's good. We might have another chance to practice it if we keep watching too.
Right. So that's one example of behavior rehearsal. Let's watch another example from another supervisor and another trainee. So in this case, the trainee is struggling with doing a self-regulation skill. So this is back to actually a trainee we saw first. So watching the therapy recording, the supervisor noticed that the trainee was going too fast while using the skill. So this was the therapist deficit. They were going too fast. So in this video, the trainee is using the word practice to practice slowing down and implementing a slower self-regulation exercise, right? So let's watch.
What are you noticing now as you're doing that? And I'll also invite you to allow your eyes to close if you want. That feels okay. Continue those nice, slow, deep breaths.
Nice. How'd that feel?
That feels even better.
Why?
Because I'm going slower and I'm regulating myself as I'm saying it.
My hope is that there's also an aspect of attunement that starts to happen, where when you're saying take a few deep breaths, her deep breaths could be faster or slower than mine happen to be, but that you're actually using what you're seeing on screen, what you're actually seeing from the client to determine when she's ready for you to go to the next piece. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So let's do this again.
And notice the supervisor ending with, let's do this again, right? So the trainee did well, but we don't stop there. We want to consolidate the skill, right? So we do a bunch of repetition. Even if there's not a clear corrective feedback, we still want to do repetition so that the trainee gets it in their bones, right? And if Tony, before we move on, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just underline, this is typically the hardest thing for supervisors to learn and retain is repetition of rehearsal is doing the training. Alex and I will review each other's supervision videos, and we see it in each other's videos. I remember showing Alex a video of my supervision, and Alex was like, how much rehearsal do you think you did? And I was like, oh, I don't know, like 20, 30 minutes. And I had done zero. Like actually zero. Like it was all just like in my mind. I had somehow imagined it. And I think it's because somehow when we're talking about skills, we have a feeling that we're actually rehearsing them. And this is why we videotape our supervision sessions and go over the videos, is because otherwise we just won't catch these things.
Keeps us honest.
Yes.
Great. So we're on the last step of the supervision model. So you've checked the client outcomes. Trainee brought a preparation form. You've identified a client challenge. You've identified a therapist deficit. You've identified a learning goal, and you've rehearsed the hell out of it. Now you're on minute 50. You need to go. The supervision is about to end, but there is still this last step, and that is to assign deliberate practice homework, which is also very strange for our field in psychotherapy, not so much for other fields. So, very simple task as a supervisor. We can literally read off the quote here. As supervisors, we say to the trainee, use the recording, the therapy recording, to repeat the same exercise we just did for at least 10 minutes until your next session with this client or our next supervision. Optionally, you can also suggest, more readings and resources and good stuff like that. Now, why would we do this? It's one thing to practice with a supervisor, but we know from the little practice research that solitary practice, meaning rehearsing on one's own time, is also essential to reach expertise, to get the skill in your bones, right? So let's imagine I just practiced initiating chair work. Tony was mentioning chair work before. I've practiced chair work with my supervisor. But now on my own time during the week, I'm going to find opportunities to practice by myself so that I can really consolidate this skill. Again, this is not conceptual homework, it's experiential homework. It's training the skill procedurally. And that's the supervision model. We covered it. I was worried, with the time we have. It's a lot of micro steps.
We got it. If anyone has questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat. We've had some really good questions along the way. I put, so if you go to the bottom of the page that Alex just put in the chat, it has all the forms that we reviewed today, and they're all free to use. We do revise and update these forms from time to time, so check back often. A common question we get from supervisors is, what should I assign as deliberate practice homework? And our rule of thumb is to assign as homework the same skill that you practiced in supervision. Do not try to get creative and come up with something fancy or new. And the reason is that if there's a new skill, the supervisee can spend a lot of time trying to figure out just how to do it, just the logistics of what to do. And that can chew up a bunch of time and end up making them confused, or basically give them a reason to be like, oh, I'm going to kick the can down the road and talk to my supervisor about it next week. So instead we say, just repeat exactly what we did. Now, if you videotaped supervision, they can go back and check the video and see exactly what you did and just repeat it again. While while we're here, I know we have a few of our supervisors here, and I'm wondering if anyone might feel comfortable just sharing briefly what it's been like learning to do this, or I see Mackenzie, you're nodding your head. How do we unmute Mackenzie?
I think I can do
Oh,
it on
great.
my own.
Thank you.
Yeah, I came in as part of one of the supervision cohorts last fall, and it has been just a delight. I've been doing relational supervision before that since 2014, and so after close to a decade, I was ready to really expand the skills, and I'm really enjoying the containment that the model provides. And the trainee that you saw clips of started seeing clients in September or October. And the skill development and the speed of skill development I've seen from her has been so incredible. I love how accelerating it is and how concrete it is. I've sat with supervisees so many times over the years who hold a lot of anxiety about doing this work well and doing it right. And with deliberate practice, I can say, okay, let's find the skills that let you feel confident in your ability to do this work well and do this work right.
Thank you, Mackenzie. We just had a great question in the chat about whether we use deliberate practice in group supervision. The short answer is yes, but it is a different format, just for various reasons. And there's a number of options with you can focus just on one person for the whole group supervision, but clearly that's not ideal. Ideally, you're getting everyone involved at different levels. So that would be a different webinar on how to do that. But at Sentio, we do individual supervision. We also do triadic supervision, where there's 2 trainees and 1 supervisor. And sometimes the second trainee is kind of observing and asking questions, and sometimes they're both presenting cases. It depends on the situation. And then, of course, we do individual and group supervision as well. Alex, we are basically out of time. Why don't we put our contact information in the chat here? I'm going to put my email if anyone wants to email me, and Alex put his email, and please don't hesitate to reach out. And we hope to see you at a future webinar or at a future event.